Look at that strange thing. A cowboy mocked the farm pony. See what the widow did next. The dust had not yet settled over Broken Ridge when the first scream cut through the pens. A pony with one clouded eye and legs that bent the wrong way stood chained to a post, surrounded by men who would not look at it twice if it were bleeding in a ditch. Somewhere behind the auction fence, a widow in a faded black dress gripped the last folded bills she owned in the world and did not look away. By the end of that week, the ground itself would try to swallow a fortune in cattle, and the only thing standing between disaster and survival would be for crooked legs nobody wanted. That is where this story begins. Before the mud and the thunder, before the men wept in front of a woman they had spent years pitying, there was only a Tuesday morning in Montana and an auction that was supposed to mean nothing. If you are watching this from a small town yourself, somewhere with dirt roads and neighbors who remember every mistake you have ever made, you already know how cruel a community can be when it decides who is useful and who is not. Type the name of your town in the comments below and tell us if you have ever seen someone written off before they had the chance to prove otherwise. If this story finds its way into your chest the way it found its way into ours, give it a like, subscribe for more, and stay until the end, because what this pony does in the mud during that storm is a moment you will not forget. Now, let the story begin. The wind over Broken Ridge, Montana, carried the smell of hay and diesel and old grief in equal measure, and it moved through the valley the way it had for 100 years, indifferent to the people trying to survive beneath it. Odora Callaway stood at the edge of that wind most mornings, on a porch that leaned slightly to the left, the same lean her husband Wendell used to joke he would fix next spring. There had been 11 springs since he said that. He was buried on the hill behind the barn, under a stone that had already started to soften at the edges, and the house around her had grown quiet in a way that a person only notices when they have run out of things to do to distract from it. She was 46 years old, though the ranchers who passed her on the road often looked at her as though she were older, as though grief had aged her the way frost ages wood, making it brittle and gray before its time. Her hands, cracked from years of rope and fence wire, still moved with the steadiness of someone who had once run 400 head of cattle alongside a husband who trusted her judgment more than his own. That ranch was smaller now, much smaller. The bank in Miles City held a note on it that grew a little heavier every season, and the men at the feed store had taken to speaking to her in the gentle, overly patient tone people use with someone they have already decided is finished. Cyrus Whitlock owned the land to the east, 9,000 acres of the best grazing ground in 3 counties, along with the finest string of quarter horses west of the Yellowstone. He was 39, broad through the shoulders, and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never once had to ask anyone for help. His father had built the Whitlock name into something people said with respect, and Cyrus had spent his life making sure it stayed that way, sometimes at the cost of the people standing in his shadow. He did not hate Odora. He simply did not see her, not really, the same way a man does not see a fence post he has walked past 10,000 times. To him, she was a widow riding out the last months before the bank finally took what gravity had already decided would fall. The Cattlemen's Association met every month in the back room of the Broken Ridge Grange Hall, and its members had begun, quietly and without cruelty they would admit to, discussing what might be done with the Callaway land once it came available. A new route for driving cattle to the rail spur in Custer County would cut 2 days off every drive, and Odora's acreage sat directly across the most direct path. Silas Merck, the association's aging president, had already made 2 visits to her porch with an offer that was, by any fair measure, generous. She had turned him down both times, and both times he had left with the same tight, patient smile of a man certain that time would do the persuading for him. It was against this backdrop, 3 days before the auction, that Odora counted the money in the tin box beneath her floorboard for the 4th time that week, $412. It was meant for the mortgage payment due at the end of the month, the payment that would keep the bank from sending another letter with red ink on the envelope. She sat with it in her lap a long while, the lamp burning low, her jaw set in the particular stillness of a woman deciding something she has not yet said out loud, even to herself. The auction was held every autumn in the flat field behind the Grange Hall, where ranchers came to sell off culls, orphan stock, and the animals nobody wanted to winter over. It was less a market than a ritual of disposal, and everyone in the county understood, without needing to be told, that whatever stood in that pen on auction day had already been judged and found wanting. That morning, the sky over Broken Ridge hung low and the color of a bruise, though no one yet understood what that particular color of sky would come to mean before the week was through. The auction crowd gathered slow and loud, the way it always did, men in canvas coats leaning on the pen rails, spitting tobacco into the dust, trading gossip about the price of beef and the state of the Callaway widow's roof. Eudora arrived on foot, having sold the truck 2 winters back, and she kept to the edge of the crowd the way she had learned to keep to edges in every room she entered since Wendell died. It was in the 3rd pen from the gate that she saw him. The pony stood alone, separated instinctively from the others by the men who had pinned him, as if his very presence might taint the healthier stock. One eye was clouded a milky blue, sightless, the lid drooping at a permanent angle that gave his whole face a look of ancient sorrow. His forelegs bowed outward at the knee, twisted in a way that made every step look like a small negotiation with pain. His coat was a patchwork of dull brown and old scars, and he stood with his head low, not from illness, but from the particular exhaustion of an animal that has learned no one is coming. A rancher named Hollis Trent, who had inherited him along with a dead uncle's failing spread, had brought him only because the auctioneer charged by the head and he wanted the pen empty by nightfall. Word moved through the crowd the way it always did before an animal like this went up, someone murmuring that the buyer would likely be a man from Billings who bought broken horses cheap and sold them along to places nobody asked questions about. Cyrus arrived late, dismounting his black gelding with the easy authority of a man who had never once doubted his welcome anywhere. He walked the rail with 2 of his hands trailing behind him, offering opinions on stock the way other men offered weather reports, confident and unbothered by contradiction. When he reached the 3rd pen, he stopped. He did not speak right away. He simply looked, the way men look at something meant to be a joke before they have decided to laugh at it. Then he turned to his hands, gestured toward the pony with his chin, and said the words that would follow him around Broken Ridge for the rest of his life. Look at that strange thing. Somebody ought to put it out of its misery before it embarrasses itself trying to walk. The men around him laughed, not cruelly exactly, but with the careless ease of people who have never had to know what it feels like to be the thing being laughed at. The pony did not react. He simply turned his head, the clouded eye facing the crowd, the good eye finding something past them, past the fence, past the ridge, as though he had long since stopped expecting kindness from any direction and had trained himself instead to watch for danger. Eudora watched Cyrus laugh, and she watched the pony not react, and something in her chest pulled tight in a way she did not examine closely. The bidding began at $10, which itself was an insult dressed up as a starting price. 2 bids rose it to $15, offered half-heartedly by men who wanted him only for the little meat and hide he might be worth. The auctioneer's voice moved fast, bored, already looking past this lot toward better stock waiting behind it. Eudora's hand went up. The auctioneer blinked, recalibrated, called her bid at 20. A rancher near the rail turned to glance at her, then at the tin box she held against her side, as though the box itself might explain the mistake. Cyrus turned too, and for the first time that morning, he actually looked at her, not through her. 25, offered someone behind her, more out of reflex than desire. Eudora raised the box slightly, the money inside it rattling faintly, and said the only 2 words she would say aloud all day. 200. The crowd went still in the particular way a crowd goes still when it senses it has just witnessed either a mistake or a decision so far outside expectation that it cannot yet be categorized as either. Cyrus's mouth curved, not quite a smile, something closer to disbelief wearing a smile's shape. Nobody countered. The gavel came down. The pony belonged to a woman who had just spent nearly half of what she owned in the world on an animal every man at that fence had already sentenced to the same fate as the dead. She led him home herself, on a rope she had to double knot because his gait made it difficult for him to keep pace. Walking the 4 miles back to her ranch at the speed his crooked legs allowed, refusing every offer of a ride from neighbors who slowed their trucks beside her only long enough to ask, not unkindly, whether she had lost her mind. She did not answer any of them. She kept walking, the pony beside her, the sky above them both the color of something about to change. Behind her, back at the fence, Cyrus lingered a while longer than the other men, watching the small, uneven shape of the pony recede down the road beside its new owner. He said nothing further about it to his hands, though one of them noted, quietly, that it was the first time in a good long while that Cyrus Whitlock had been left without a joke to finish. He mounted his gelding and rode home in a silence he did not examine, the kind of silence a man rides through without ever quite admitting that something in him has been unsettled. That night, she named him Bramble, for the thorny, low-growing thing that survives where nothing else will, and she did not yet know that within 4 days, every soul in that county would remember the name. Before any of that, though, there was the walk home and the long silence that filled it. The road from the Grange Hall to the Callaway Ranch ran alongside 3 other properties before reaching her own gate, and every truck that slowed beside her on that 4-mile stretch carried a face she recognized, a neighbor who had once brought a casserole to Wendell's funeral, a rancher who had shaken her husband's hand at church suppers for 20 years. None of them stopped for long. They rolled their windows down just enough to offer a word of concern dressed as advice, and then rolled them back up and drove on, leaving her with the pony and the wind and the long gray light sliding down toward evening. She thought, more than once during that walk, of the mortgage payment she no longer had the money for, of the letter that would come from the bank in a few weeks demanding an explanation she did not yet have, of the particular shame of standing in front of a teller and admitting that she had spent the payment on an animal 3 men at the auction had called worthless within earshot of the entire county. She did not turn back. Whatever had moved her hand upward at that auction had not asked her permission, and she had learned, somewhere in the 11 years since Wendell's death, not to argue with the parts of herself that acted before her mind caught up to explain why. Bramble limped the entire distance without complaint, though complaint would have been forgivable in an animal carrying legs built the way his were. He stopped twice to rest, standing with his head low and his sides heaving, and both times Odora simply stood beside him and waited, offering nothing but her presence, until he found the will to continue on his own. By the time they reached her gate, the last color had drained from the sky, and the porch light Wendell had installed years before, the one that still worked despite everything else on the place that had slowly stopped, cast a small yellow circle over the dirt yard. She led Bramble to the paddock behind the barn, latched the gate, and stood there a long while in the cold, watching him lower himself carefully into the straw she had laid out that morning, before she herself had known she would need it for anything. She did not sleep well that night. She sat at the kitchen table with the tin box empty in front of her, running her thumb along its edges, and somewhere past midnight she allowed herself, for the first time since the funeral, to cry without trying to stop it, though she could not have said, if anyone had asked her, whether the tears were for the money she had spent or the years she had spent alone or the strange, stubborn hope that had lodged itself in her chest the moment she raised her hand at that fence. The first week was not gentle. Bramble would not eat from her hand for 3 full days, backing into the corner of the small paddock behind her barn each time she approached, his head lowered, the clouded eye tracking her more than the working one, as if the damaged eye had somehow become the one he trusted to warn him of harm. Odora did not push. She had learned patience the hard way, in the 11 years since Wendell's funeral, in the long silent evenings when patience was the only companion the house offered her. She sat outside the paddock rail each evening with a bucket of oats beside her, not looking at him directly, letting the wind and the settling dark do the work that words could not. On the 4th evening, he crossed half the distance between them on his own, the crooked forelegs folding and straightening in that same careful negotiation, and lowered his head to the bucket while she sat perfectly still, her breath shallow, afraid that moving even slightly might undo whatever fragile trust had just been built. It was during the 2nd week that she first noticed something odd in the way he moved. A storm had rolled through the valley 2 nights prior, the kind that left the ground soft and uncertain, and when Odora walked him out along the fence line the following morning, Bramble stopped dead at a patch of earth that looked, to her eye, no different from any other patch of earth around it. He would not step on it. He circled it, ears pinned forward, nostrils working, and when she finally led him around instead of through, the ground where he had refused to walk gave way an hour later beneath the weight of a fence post she was trying to reset, revealing a hollow undercut carved out by runoff, deep enough to have snapped a leg had anyone stepped on it unaware. She stood over that hollow a long moment, looking back at the pony grazing calmly 20 feet away as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Word of the odd little pony spread slowly at first, the way most things did in a county where gossip traveled at the speed of a shared fence line. It reached the feed store, where old Ansel Whitfield, who had been shoeing horses in Broken Ridge for 40 years, mentioned to a customer that he had once known a mare on his father's ranch who could feel weather in her hooves before it arrived. And maybe the widow's pony had something similar in him, some old instinct bred deep and rare, the kind that shows up in an animal nobody was watching for greatness. Eudora did not put much stock in it herself. She simply noticed. She noticed that Bramble grew agitated hours before the sky changed. She noticed that when a rabbit darted beneath the fence and spooked her one remaining hen into a frenzy, Bramble did not flinch, did not startle, but instead moved calmly toward the commotion, lowering his head near the terrified bird until its wings stilled, as though something in his stillness bled outward and settled whatever chaos came near him. She began to test it without quite admitting to herself that she was testing anything. She led him near the skittish colt she boarded for a neighbor, an animal so nervous it had bitten two different hands that tried to halter it, and watched Bramble simply stand nearby, unbothered, until the colt's own panic ebbed in confused imitation of the pony's calm. It was not magic. She did not believe in magic. Not anymore. Not since watching Wendell's heart give out in a hayfield on an ordinary Thursday with no warning at all. But it was something, some frequency the pony operated on that other animals seemed to recognize even when people did not. Cyrus heard about the pony too, secondhand, through one of his hands who had stopped by the feed store, and he laughed about it over supper, the same easy laugh he had given at the auction, the laugh of a man for whom the world had rarely offered a surprise large enough to require humility. He did not know yet how soon that laugh would curdle in his mouth. There was, in the days that followed the auction, a particular kind of scrutiny that fell over the Callaway ranch, the sort reserved for anyone who has done something a community cannot quite categorize as either foolish or brave. Women at the Grange Hall bake sale spoke of Eudora in careful, clipped sentences, admiring her nerve in one breath and questioning her judgment in the next, as though the two could somehow be separated cleanly. Silas Merck himself paid her a visit during that stretch, his third attempt at the land, arriving with a fresh offer typed neatly on association letterhead, an offer that had grown by exactly $40 an acre since his previous visit, as though he believed her circumstances, and therefore her price, had grown more desperate rather than less. She met him on the porch rather than inviting him inside, a small refusal that Silas noted but did not comment on. He spoke for some time about the association's plans, about the rail spur, about the difficulty of maintaining a ranch alone in a county that increasingly favored consolidation over small holdings. He was not unkind in his delivery, and that, in its own way, made the offer harder to refuse, because kindness wrapped around persistence has a way of wearing down resistance that outright hostility never could. Eudora listened to all of it with her arms crossed against the cold, and when he finished, she told him only that she was not selling, not that week, not that season, and that he was welcome to ask again in the spring if he still felt the need. Silas left with the same tight smile he always wore, the smile of a patient man certain the seasons themselves would eventually argue his case for him better than he could. Behind her, in the paddock, Bramble had watched the entire exchange without moving, his ears tracking Silas's truck long after it disappeared down the drive, as though some part of him understood, in whatever wordless way animals understand the shape of danger, that the man in the clean truck represented a threat no less real for being made of paperwork instead of teeth. At his own supper table that same week, Cyrus found himself, more than once, thinking of the widow's strange little bidding war without quite meaning to. His wife had passed 3 years prior, and the house he kept now ran on the quiet, efficient rhythms of hired help rather than family, a fact that had never troubled him much until lately, when the silence at his own table had begun to feel less like peace and more like something waiting to be named. He mentioned the pony once more to his foreman, a weathered man named Otis who had worked the Whitlock land for 30 years, and Otis, unusually, did not laugh along with him. Otis simply said that his own grandfather used to claim the ugliest animal in any herd was often the one still standing after the rest had gone, and that a man ought to be careful mistaking strangeness for weakness. Cyrus waved the comment off at the time. The way a man waves off things he intends to forget, but the words settled somewhere in him regardless, the way certain sentences do, waiting patiently for the moment they will matter. 3 days later, the Weather Service in Miles City issued a warning that most ranchers in the valley shrugged off as routine autumn bluster. A storm system moving down from the Canadian border expected to bring heavy rain to already saturated ground. Nobody in Broken Ridge paid it the attention it deserved. They had seen storms before. They did not yet understand this one would be different, that the ground beneath Cyrus Whitlock's finest pasture, the one bordering the ravine that separated his land from Eudora's, had already been quietly weakened by a summer of underground erosion nobody had bothered to survey. The morning the storm arrived, Eudora woke to Bramble screaming. It was not a sound she had heard from him before, not the low nickers or soft snorts of routine unease, but a high, cutting cry that brought her out of bed and onto the porch before she had even found her boots. He was pressed against the far rail of the paddock, eyes wide, body trembling, staring not at the sky, which had already gone the color of wet slate, but at the ground itself, at the earth beneath his own hooves, as though it had begun speaking to him in a language only he understood. She did not know it yet, standing barefoot on her leaning porch with the wind rising around her, but the earth was, in its own way, telling the truth. And 2 miles east, on Cyrus Whitlock's land, 70 of his finest bulls were about to become trapped in a ravine that the coming rain would turn into a grave. The storm broke fully by mid-morning, and it broke with a violence the valley had not seen in a decade. Rain fell in sheets thick enough to blur the ridge line from Eudora's porch entirely, and the wind carried with it the particular smell of saturated earth beginning to fail, a smell old ranchers know without needing to name it. Somewhere beneath that rain, the underground erosion that had gone unnoticed all summer finally gave way, and a slow collapse began working its way through the soil beneath Cyrus's eastern pasture, the ground sinking in stages too gradual to see and too fast to stop. The bulls, 70 head of prize breeding stock worth more than most ranches in the county combined, had been moved to that pasture only the week before, grazing near the mouth of a ravine that had always seemed stable, that Cyrus's father and his father before him had used without incident for 3 generations. When the ground beneath the ravine's upper lip finally slumped, it did so without warning, carrying a section of fence and several tons of mud downward, and the panicked herd, already spooked by thunder, bolted directly into the narrowing throat of the ravine instead of away from it, the way frightened animals so often run toward the very danger meant to be avoided. By the time Cyrus reached the scene on horseback, soaked through, his hands riding hard beside him, the herd was trapped in a bowl of mud and unstable slope, the only path out a narrow channel of ground that had already begun sliding in slow, wet sheets whenever weight touched it. 2 of his best horses, animals bred for cutting and roping and generations of careful selection, refused outright to enter that channel, rearing and wheeling away each time a rider tried to press them forward, their instincts screaming what their riders could not yet see, that the ground itself was no longer solid, that one wrong step could bury horse and rider both. Cyrus stood at the ravine's edge in the driving rain, his authority for the first time in his life meeting a problem it could not simply outmatch. His hands looked to him for direction, and for a long, terrible moment, he had none to give. Below him, his bulls bellowed and pressed together in a mass of terror, sinking slowly, inch by inch, into ground that was actively swallowing them. It was Silas Merck, arriving late with 2 other men from the association to survey storm damage on the shared boundary line, who first suggested, almost as a bitter joke, that perhaps the widow's strange little pony, the one with the unnatural sense for bad ground, might be worth sending for. Cyrus's jaw tightened at the suggestion. Pride is a particular kind of drowning, quiet and internal, and for a moment it looked as though he might choose to drown in it rather than ask for help from the woman he had mocked in public only days before. But the bulls screamed again below him, one visibly sinking to its chest in mud that had not been mud an hour earlier, and something in Cyrus's face shifted, cracked open just slightly, enough to let through the version of him that had not yet fully calcified into arrogance. He sent a rider. The rider found Eudora already outside, already watching her own fence line with the wary attention of someone who understood the storm was worse than ordinary. Bramble beside her in the paddock, agitated but not screaming now, his ears swiveling toward the east, as though he had already sensed the disaster unfolding 2 miles off before any messenger arrived to describe it. The rider delivered the message breathlessly. Cyrus's exact words softened only slightly out of some instinct for decency. The bulls were trapped, the ground unstable. No horse on the Whitlock ranch would enter the ravine. And would she please consider, bringing the pony? Eudora stood very still. There was a version of this moment where she said no, where the memory of every laugh directed at Bramble, every insult, every casual cruelty dressed up as humor, rose up and closed her mouth around a refusal that would have been, by any reasonable measure, understandable. Cyrus had called her animal a strange thing unworthy of anything but pity or disposal. He had predicted her ruin to an entire crowd of witnesses. He owed her nothing, and she owed him even less. She looked at Bramble instead. He was watching her, the clouded eye and the good eye both fixed on her face, waiting, the way he always waited, for her to decide something so that he could decide alongside her. She went inside and returned with the harness for her light cart, the one Wendell had built years before for hauling feed across ground too rough for the truck, and she began, without a single word of explanation to the startled rider still sitting his horse in the rain, to prepare her pony for the ravine. The rider asked her, with the particular disbelief of someone watching a decision he cannot understand being made in real time, whether she meant to actually bring him. She tightened the last buckle, looked up at the young man through rain that had already soaked her hair flat against her skull, and said only, "He sees what your horses can't." Then she led Bramble out into the storm, toward the man who had called him worthless, to save the animals of the very neighbor who had humiliated her in front of the whole county. The cart wheels cut deep ruts into the softening road, and twice Eudora had to climb down and lead Bramble by hand through low stretches already running with runoff, her boots filling with cold water, her coat plastered flat against her back. The rider who had brought the message stayed a short distance behind them the entire way, unwilling to ride ahead and unwilling to fall back, caught in the strange gravity of a decision he did not fully understand but recognized as significant. She did not speak during that ride, and neither did he. The silence between them filled instead by the drumming of rain against canvas and the labored, uneven rhythm of the pony's crooked gait against the mud. Somewhere in that silence, Eudora allowed herself to think, briefly and without indulgence, of the many mornings she had woken in that same house alone, certain that whatever use she once had in this valley had ended the same day Wendell's heart did. She did not examine the thought long. There was no room for it now, not with the rain rising and the ravine waiting somewhere ahead of them, swallowing a fortune in cattle 1 inch at a time. By the time the ranch buildings of the Whitlock spread came into view through the gray curtain of rain, the sound of the trapped herd had already begun to carry across the wind, a low, constant bellow of distress that seemed to rise directly out of the ground itself, as though the earth had found its own voice to describe what it was doing to the animals trapped inside it. The ravine, when Eudora arrived, looked like something out of an old flood story, a wound in the earth filling slowly with mud the consistency of wet cement, the bulls crowded together in its lowest point, some already sunk to their bellies, bellowing in a chorus that carried up over the wind. Cyrus stood at the rim with his hands, all of them soaked and helpless, watching his life's work sink in front of him. He turned when he heard the cart wheels, and whatever he had expected to see, it was not this. A widow in a soaked black coat, her jaw set, leading a crooked-legged pony toward the one place every trained horse on his ranch had refused to go. He did not laugh this time. He did not have it in him. Eudora did not wait for permission or ceremony. She unhitched Bramble from the cart itself, deciding in the last moment that his own instincts, unencumbered by the extra weight and awkward geometry of a wagon, would serve them better than her original plan, and she looped a long lead rope from his halter instead, keeping herself just behind his shoulder, letting him choose the path while she followed rather than led. Bramble hesitated at the rim of the ravine only once, his nostrils working, his weight shifting back onto his haunches in a moment that looked, to the men watching, exactly like the fear their own horses had already shown. Cyrus's face, for that single second, betrayed something close to relief, an ugly, private relief that the pony would refuse to and prove the world had been right about him all along. Then Bramble stepped forward. He did not move in a straight line. He moved in a slow, deliberate weave, testing each patch of ground with a single hoof before committing his weight, retreating twice from places that looked, to the human eye, identical to the ground on either side of them, but that some deeper sense told him were hollow beneath the surface. Eudora followed his exact path, step for step, refusing to deviate even when her own instinct screamed that a more direct route would be faster. The mud pulled at both of them, thick and cold, rising past the pony's crooked knees, past Eudora's boots, and still Bramble pressed on, guiding them both along a narrow, invisible seam of stable ground that curved through the ravine like a path only he could see. Above them, on the rim, Cyrus watched in a silence that had gone entirely out of him, the silence of a man watching every assumption he had built his life on come apart in real time. Reaching the trapped herd took nearly 40 minutes of that slow, careful weaving, 40 minutes in which the rain never once let up, in which the ground beneath the bulls continued its patient, silent collapse. When Bramble finally reached the edge of the herd, he did not startle them further the way a strange horse might have. He simply stood among the panicking cattle, utterly still, his presence somehow cutting through their terror the way it had cut through the colt's panic weeks before, the way it had cut through the terrified hen. One by one, the bulls nearest him began to quiet, their thrashing easing into something closer to trembling stillness. Enough stillness that Eudora, working alongside two of Cyrus's hands who had finally found the courage to wade in behind her, could begin looping ropes around the animals nearest the stable seam of ground Bramble had found. It was slow work, brutal work, mud-soaked and freezing. Every animal pulled free, representing minutes stolen from a clock that none of them could see, but all of them could feel ticking downward. Bramble stood at the center of it for over an hour, unmoving despite his own exhaustion beginning to show in the trembling of his crooked legs, a living anchor of calm in the middle of chaos, while one bull after another was hauled, driven, and coaxed back along the narrow, safe path toward solid ground. Cyrus himself waded into the mud partway through that long hour, unable any longer to simply stand at the rim and watch, though his presence in the ravine did little beyond adding another pair of hands to the ropes. He worked alongside his own men without giving orders now, following instead the quiet, wordless rhythm Eudora had established, a rhythm built entirely around the pony's pace rather than any man's impatience. More than once, he found himself watching Bramble instead of the cattle, studying the way the animal held perfectly still amid chaos, the way his damaged legs bore weight, without complaint despite hours of standing in cold mud, and something in that study began, slowly, to dismantle the certainty he had carried into the ravine that morning. There is a particular humility that settles into a man only when he watches something he dismissed perform a task his own resources could not accomplish, and Cyrus felt the first edges of it there in the mud, though he would not have called it humility at the time. He would only have said, if anyone had asked him in that moment, that he had misjudged the pony's legs and left the rest of what he was feeling unspoken, the way men in that valley so often left the largest things unspoken until circumstance forced them into the open. It was during the 63rd animal, with only 7 bulls remaining, that the ground beneath Bramble himself began, finally, to give. It happened without warning, the way the ground always seems to fail precisely when exhaustion has stripped away the last of anyone's vigilance. A section of the seam Bramble had followed and guarded for over an hour, weakened now by the sheer volume of mud and hooves that had crossed it, sank suddenly beneath his hindquarters, and the pony went down hard, his back legs plunging into mud that closed around them like something alive and hungry. Eudora's scream tore through the rain before she had even fully processed what she was seeing. She was at his side within seconds, mud soaking her to the chest, her hands gripping his halter as he thrashed, his crooked forelegs scrabbling for purchase on ground that offered none, his clouded eye rolling white with a terror she had never once seen in him, not even on the day she carried him home from the auction. Cyrus was already moving before he had decided to move, sliding down the churned slope of the ravine with 2 of his hands close behind, abandoning every last trace of the distance he had maintained all morning. He reached Eudora's side and threw himself into the mud beside the struggling pony, his hands finding purchase beneath Bramble's chest, shouting instructions to his men in a voice that had entirely lost its usual command, replaced by something raw and urgent that none of them had heard from him before. Eudora worked at the halter and the rope, trying to guide rather than force, aware that panic in an animal already sinking could drown him faster than the mud itself. She spoke to him in a low, steady voice, the words themselves meaningless, a string of nothing meant only to give him something solid to hold on to through sound since the ground had betrayed him. Bramble's struggling eased, not because the danger had lessened, but because something in her voice reached whatever deep, wordless part of him had always listened for her. Cyrus's men worked ropes beneath the pony's hindquarters, the mud fighting every inch of leverage they tried to gain, the rain making every surface slick and uncertain. For nearly 10 minutes that felt considerably longer to everyone standing in that ravine, it was not at all clear whether the ground would release him or claim him entirely. Twice the rope slipped in the mud-slicked hands of Cyrus's men, and twice Eudora refused to let go of the halter even as the strain threatened to pull her forward into the same collapsing ground that held the pony, her knuckles white, her voice never once rising to match the panic tightening in her chest. Somewhere behind her, distantly, she heard Cyrus shouting for more rope, for another man, for anything that might tip the balance in their favor before the ground finished what it had started. And beneath all of it, she kept her eyes fixed on Bramble's one good eye, refusing to let him see anything in her face but the same steady patience she had offered him every evening at that paddock rail. Then, with a final coordinated pull, timed to a moment when Bramble himself found some final reserve of strength and lunged forward with his own damaged forelegs, the mud released its grip all at once, and the pony came free, collapsing onto more solid ground a few feet distant, sides heaving, legs trembling violently, but alive. Eudora dropped to her knees beside him in mud that no longer mattered to her at all, her hands running along his neck, his shoulders, checking for injury with the desperate thoroughness of someone who has already lost one person she loved without warning and refuses to lose another the same way. Bramble's breath came in ragged heaves, but as good I found her face, and something in the exhausted stillness of him told her, more clearly than words ever could, that he had chosen to survive. The remaining 7 bulls were brought out over the following hour by the men themselves, working now with a courage borrowed directly from what they had just watched a small, broken pony do without complaint or hesitation. By the time the last animal stood shivering but safe on solid ground, the rain had begun, finally, to soften into something closer to drizzle, as though the storm itself had spent its cruelty and had nothing left to prove. Cyrus knelt in the mud beside Bramble for a long moment after the work was done, his hands, the same hands that had gestured dismissively at this animal only days before, now resting gently against the pony's heaving side. When he finally looked up at Eudora, his face carried none of the confidence that had defined every previous meeting between them. It carried instead the particular exposure of a man who has just watched everything he believed about worth and usefulness come apart in the mud in front of his own men. He said nothing for a long while. Then, slowly, deliberately, in front of the same hands who had once laughed alongside him at the auction fence, Cyrus Whitlock removed his hat, lowered himself further into the mud, and bowed his head before the widow he had spent years overlooking. "I was wrong about him," he said, his voice unsteady in a way none of his men had ever heard before. "I was wrong about you too." Eudora did not answer right away. She simply looked at him, rain-soaked and exhausted, her hand still resting on the trembling shoulder of the animal that had just saved 70 lives and very nearly lost his own doing it. And for the first time in 11 long years, something in her chest that had been clenched tight since a hayfield and a Thursday morning began, cautiously, to loosen. The days following the storm moved slower than the storm itself, the way aftermath always does, filled with the quiet, unglamorous work of tending to what disaster leaves behind. Bramble did not walk easily for nearly a week. His crooked legs, already burdened by their natural bend, had strained further in the mud, and Eudora spent those days in the paddock with cold compresses and patient hands, refusing every offer of help from neighbors who had, only days before, considered her a lost cause. Cyrus himself came by twice, standing at the paddock rail in a silence that had replaced his old easy confidence with something more careful, watching the pony's slow recovery with an attentiveness that surprised even his own men. The Cattlemen's Association did not let the matter rest quietly. However, word had reached them, distorted through several retellings, that Eudora had crossed onto Whitlock land without formal permission during the rescue, and Silas Merck, ever protective of procedure even when procedure had nearly cost 70 bulls their lives, raised the matter at the following week's meeting as a potential liability the association could not simply ignore, particularly given the ongoing question of the Callaway acreage and its place in their expansion plans. It was Cyrus who stood before the assembled ranchers that evening, still carrying the particular stiffness of a man unaccustomed to defending someone rather than dismissing them. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated, plainly, that the widow Callaway and her pony had saved his herd and very likely spared his ranch from a loss that would have crippled it for years, and that any man in that room who wished to argue a technicality of boundary lines could take the matter up with him directly. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a man's reputation shifts too fast for the people around him to keep pace with it. Cyrus did more than silence the objection. In the weeks that followed, he personally assumed the remaining balance on Eudora's mortgage, framing it not as charity, a word he seemed to understand she would never accept, but as fair payment for services rendered, a debt owed for a herd saved. He proposed further, in a conversation held at her kitchen table over coffee neither of them drank much of, a lasting partnership between their two ranches, one in which the rehabilitation of injured, discarded, and unwanted animals, the ones nobody else wanted to give a second look, would find a permanent home on her land, funded in part by his own considerable resources. Eudora listened to the proposal with the same careful stillness she brought to everything since Wendell's death, and when she finally answered, it was not with gratitude exactly, but with something steadier, something closer to the recognition of an equal. She said yes. Not everyone in Broken Ridge accepted the shift easily. Silas Merck, in particular, took the news of Cyrus's intervention as a personal affront, muttering to the other association members that a single storm did not erase years of sound business planning, that sentiment was a poor substitute for progress. He raised the matter of the rail spur route once more at the following meeting, only to find that Cyrus, whose land the association needed far more than Eudora's, had quietly withdrawn his support for the expansion entirely, informing the room in a voice that had lost none of its old authority, even if it had gained something new beneath it, that the widow's fence line would remain exactly where it stood for as long as she wished it to. The meeting ended earlier than usual that evening, and Silas did not return to the Callaway porch again that year. There were smaller changes too, the kind that never made it into any meeting minutes, but mattered all the same. The women who had once spoken of Eudora in careful, clipped sentences at the bake sale began instead to ask after her directly, bringing preserves and bread to her door in the weeks after the storm, sitting with her at her own kitchen table in a way none of them had managed since Wendell's funeral. Grief, Eudora had learned long ago, tends to isolate a person more thoroughly than any single insult ever could, and it was strange to feel that isolation loosened not because of anything she had said, but because of what a battered, crooked pony had done in the mud while the whole county watched. She paid off the remaining sliver of the mortgage that Cyrus's contribution had not already covered within the month, using money earned, for the first time in years, from boarding fees paid by neighbors who now wanted their own difficult animals gentled the way Bramble had been gentled, patiently and without force. It was not a fortune. It did not need to be. It was simply proof, folded neatly into a bank ledger, that the ranch would stand another season, and likely the season after that. She kept the tin box beneath the floorboard even after it was no longer needed for hiding anything, and some evenings she still opened it out of habit, running her fingers along its empty corners the way a person touches an old scar, not out of pain any longer, but out of a quiet need to remember exactly how close the whole of it had come to going the other way. Winter came to Broken Ridge the way it always did, hard and early, but the ranch beneath the leaning porch looked different that year than it had in the 11 years since Wendell was buried on the hill behind the barn. New paddocks had gone up along the eastern fence line, built with lumber and labor that Cyrus's men provided without being asked twice, and within them stood the first handful of animals nobody else in the county had wanted, a mare with a ruined hip, a dog too scarred to trust easily, a goat born with legs that would never quite hold him steady. Bramble moved among them each morning with the same quiet authority he had shown in the ravine, no longer alone in his strangeness, but instead something closer to an elder among his own kind of misfit. Cyrus visited often, and the town noticed, the way small towns always notice, that his visits had less to do with cattle business and more to do with the particular ease that had grown between him and the widow he had once mocked in public. Neither of them rushed toward naming what had grown there. Some things, they both seemed to understand without saying, needed the same patience Bramble had required in those first silent evenings at the paddock rail. The clouded eye never healed, and the crooked legs never straightened, and Bramble carried both, always, as a visible record of everything the world had once decided he could not be. But he walked those paddocks each morning with a steadiness that had nothing to do with symmetry, greeting each new broken creature that arrived at Odora's gate the way he had once greeted a trembling colt and a panicked hen, offering them, without a single word spoken in any language humans could measure, the same thing he had once needed himself. Proof that being overlooked is not the same as being without worth. There were mornings still, even that winter, when Odora woke before dawn and lay a long while in the dark, listening to the wind move across the roof the way it always had, and felt the old ache of the empty half of the bed beside her, an ache that no pony, no partnership, no restored ledger would ever fully erase. Some losses do not close. They simply learn to sit beside a person more quietly, making room, over time, for other things to grow up around them. She had made a kind of peace with that arrangement. One Wendell himself, she suspected, would have recognized and approved of the particular Montana piece of a person who keeps working the land regardless of what the land has already taken from her. Bramble grew slower with the years, as all animals do, his crooked legs stiffening further each winter, the milky eye clouding further still, but he remained, always, the first to greet any new arrival at the gate, standing in that same low, watchful stillness that had once calmed a colt and a rebellion of frightened cattle both. Ranchers from counties away began sending their own hopeless cases to the Callaway spread eventually. Animals other people had already written off, and each one arrived to find, waiting at the paddock rail, a small, patient, imperfect teacher who understood exactly what it meant to be dismissed and had decided, long before any of them arrived, that dismissal was not the same thing as an ending. Cyrus Whitlock, for his part, never again mocked an animal at auction, and the men who worked his ranch noticed, without ever discussing it openly among themselves, that he had grown quieter in the years since the storm, quieter and, in some manner none of them could quite name, kinder, as though something essential in him had been reordered in that ravine and had simply stayed that way ever since. He took to visiting the paddock rail some evenings on his own, without any errand to justify it, standing beside the fence along, while watching the crooked little pony graze among the other broken animals in the fading light. And on more than one of those evenings, Odora came to stand beside him without either of them saying much of anything at all, the silence between them no longer the guarded silence of strangers, but something closer to the comfortable quiet of two people who had already said, through mud and rope and a storm neither of them chose, everything that truly needed saying. Somewhere on a ridge in Montana, a pony with one clouded eye still walks among the animals nobody else wanted, and a widow who was once told she was finished still wakes each morning to tend a ranch that very nearly slipped through her fingers. Neither of them was ever meant to be the hero of anything. That is, perhaps, the whole of what this story has to offer, that the ones written off before they are given a chance are so often the ones who end up saving everyone else. If this story stayed with you, tell us where you are watching from, and tell someone in your life today that they are not as invisible as the world sometimes convinces them they are. Like this video, subscribe for more stories like it, and we will see you in the next one.